Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm New York State Inspector General Lucy Lang, and I invite you to join me in a moment of silence before we begin this afternoon's program. Thank you. Shortly after 11 p.m. on Friday, June 5th, 2015, convicted murderers David Sweat and Richard Matt slipped through holes they had cut in the back walls of their cells in the Honor Block at Clinton Correctional Facility. Using pipes as hand and footholds, Sweat and Matt descended 3 tiers through the narrow space behind their prison cells to the prison's subterranean level. There, they navigated a labyrinth of dimly lit tunnels and squeezed through a series of openings in walls and a steam pipe along a route they had prepared over the previous 3 months. When, at midnight, they emerged from a manhole onto a village of Dannemora Street, a block outside the prison wall, Sweat and Matt had accomplished the first escape from the high security section of Clinton in more than 100 years. When they were discovered missing the next morning, the New York State Police launched a manhunt involving at times more than 1,300 officers from local, state, federal, and Canadian law enforcement agencies. The ensuing 3-week manhunt disrupted and brought fear to communities and residents throughout the region and cost New York State more than $23 million in state law enforcement overtime. It also brought out the best in New Yorkers, who rallied around the efforts. While the manhunt was ongoing, the then governor directed then Inspector General Catherine Leahy Scott to, quote, conduct a thorough investigation to determine all factors potentially involved in the escape and recommend any potential reforms and best practices to prevent future incidents. The Inspector General's 150-page report that followed, from which I have been quoting, provides the most comprehensive accounting of that history. The escape, manhunt, and investigation are the subject of today's event, and I am pleased to introduce now Judge Leahy Scott to begin our conversation.
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Leahy Scott, and I'm currently a judge with the New York State Court of Claims. I was formerly the 9th Inspector General for the state of New York and served during the time 2 incarcerated individuals escaped from Clinton Correctional Facility on the night of June 5th, 2015. First, I want to thank the Rockefeller Institute for hosting the event today, and I would like to give special thanks to our current Inspector General, Lucy Lang, for organizing and moderating today's panel. There are a few times in your life when something momentous, noteworthy, or important happens, and you remember exactly where you were and what you were doing. The morning of June 6, 2015 was a beautiful spring Saturday morning, and I remember my husband and I were having coffee, listening to the news, getting ready to do some outside chores, when I heard the news break that 2 incarcerated individuals had escaped from Clinton Correctional Facility. As my husband was watching the news with absolute amazement and astonishment, I immediately knew this news would have a direct impact on me. As the Inspector General, I have jurisdiction over the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, also known as DOCS, and the correctional facilities throughout New York State, and that I would be involved in some sort of investigation. As this thought went through my head, my phone started to ring. There were many phone calls made and received that day, which of course left my husband to do all those chores by himself. It is hard to believe that 10 years has passed by, but I would like to offer some insights into what I was thinking, observing at that time. I'm not going to recount all the specifics, facts of the escape. It's been in the recent news accounts, and there, of course, is this 150-page report you can read. In the initial days of the escape, what was paramount, of course, was capturing these 2 individuals, Richard Matt and David Sweat. In these first few days, I had to assemble an investigative team comprised of attorneys, investigators, and auditors who were going to be involved in the investigation of how this escape occurred. We developed a plan. What needed to be done first, what documents were needed to initially review, and things of that sort. It was critical in those first days to try to access the facility to obtain these records, conduct interviews. However, I understood that law enforcement had to proceed first and take lead in order to locate and capture these 2 murderers. I knew I had to initially defer to law enforcement in order for them to permit them to do their very important job. However, as diligent and comprehensive the law enforcement effort was in attempting to locate these 2 escapees, hours turned into days and days turned into weeks. I admit that I was anxious but trying to be patient to start our investigation. However, I became very concerned that too much time was passing and very concerned about promptly securing important information and or evidence. So on June 15th, 2015, Governor Andrew M. Cuomo affirmed the IG's authority over docs and directed me to conduct a thorough investigation to determine all factors potentially involved in the escape and recommend reforms and best practices to prevent future incidents. The first order of business for me was to visit the Clinton Correctional Facility, which I did along with members of my executive and senior investigative staff. Photos do not do justice illustrating the imposing walls of that facility. The enormity of those walls is truly incredible. Upon arriving, I first went to the New York State Police Command Center to say hello and to meet Superintendent Joe D'Amico's staff, and also to let them know that we were now going to be at the facility. I am thankful, and still am, for all the assistance Superintendent D'Amico and his members provided us during the investigation. After leaving the command center, we then went to the facility's entrance, were processed through the now evident and stringent security checks, and was provided a tour. I visited the entire facility. I went to Matt and Sweat's cells. I saw the holes in the wall. I viewed the catwalk, which was behind each of their cells. I walked the honor block where Matt and Sweat lived. The facility at the time was still in lockdown, and the incarcerated individuals were all in their cells. And as I walked through the honor block, not one word was spoken, and the entire block was eerily quiet. I saw the bowels of the facility, the labyrinth of the pipes and tunnels. I viewed that first wall that Sweat encountered and how he carefully removed the red brick to gain entrance into the next section of the facility. I also viewed in the basement the facility's outer wall that Sweat had encountered. That's where he initially attempted to break through, but then switched and decided to cut through the steam pipe. And I observed how big that steam pipe was, that they both had to shimmy through this very narrow pipe to find themselves on the other side of the prison wall. I viewed the iron ladder leading to the manhole, which led to a residential street, resulting in their limited time of freedom. After viewing all this, it was clear to me that these extraordinary attempts to break out and the tools utilized were not the work of just one person, but that this person had help. Additionally, all these efforts had to take an inordinate amount of time. The observations I made were very much investigated by my office. Ultimately, it was revealed that Sweat spent approximately 4 months cutting out of his cell and developing his path of escape throughout the basement of the Clinton Correctional Facility. Additionally, and incredibly, Sweat admitted he spent almost 3 months outside his cell working on his escape without ever being detected. The COs were responsible and required to do regular nightly counts of all incarcerated individuals in their cells, and they missed Sweat being out of his cell for over 400 times. Moreover, the breach in both Matt and Sweat's cell wall leading to the catwalk in the basement was never detected, despite the occurrence of at least 15 weekly scheduled cell inspections and one unannounced cell search. Thereafter, I toured the vocational shops and specifically saw the tailor shop where Matt Sweat and Joyce Mitchell, the civilian supervisor of the tailor shop, worked. There was an elevated desk where Mitchell would sit alongside a correctional officer who was charged with the security over the classroom. I observed the rows of sewing machine stations where the incarcerated individuals worked, the closets in that room, a storage room. Behind the elevated desk, I observed a row of windows which caught my attention. Looking out the window, I could see in the distance the steam plant. From the steam plant to the facility was a road with several manhole covers. As I was observing this, it occurred to me that this plan to escape was probably hatched right there in the tailor shop, where they manipulated a civilian worker and looked at that road and steam plant every day that they worked in their vocational program. As I was marking this moment, my executive deputy came over to me as it appeared I was lingering. I remember looking at him and said, "Look out the window." And he did. And then he looked at me with a nod, and he understood what I was thinking. Now, Doc Central staff cooperated throughout this investigation, I would say I had daily or near daily communication with Doc's then counsel and then executive deputy commissioner, especially at the near conclusion of the investigation when we discussed corrective action that needed to be implemented by Doc's. Doc's also provided my team with a building within the correctional facility for the purposes of conducting the investigation. It was very helpful to have this space within the correctional facility walls. Notably, though, obtaining pertinent and critical documents was made extremely difficult due to the lack of digitization of those documents, requiring our team to carefully review, they had to find, and then scrutinize thousands of paper documents. I should point out also that as our investigation commenced, there were parallel investigations. Clearly, law enforcement were conducting interviews, following leads that were provided to them in order to apprehend the escapees. Additionally, law enforcement were executing search warrants, which was yielding very important information and evidence. The state police ultimately made the arrest of Joyce Mitchell, that tailor shop employee who endeared herself to the escapees, and Eugene Palmer, a correction officer who befriended the escapees while in prison as well. The district attorney of Clinton County was obviously involved as he was charged with prosecuting the defendants. And when Sweat was captured, he too was charged with crimes. Sweat, Mitchell, and Palmer all reached plea bargain agreements with the Clinton County District Attorney, which included their cooperation with my investigation. Now, also, Doc's was involved in their own investigation as they were placing identified errant employees on administrative leave. Now, as part of the cooperation agreement with the Clinton County District Attorney, Mitchell, Palmer, and Sweat testified under oath before me and the investigative team. Regardless of what they told us, the facts of this investigation were determined by the investigation conducted by my very competent and professional staff. Nothing was accepted wholesale from these convicted criminals. Now, I personally participated in the interviews of these individuals, and those interviews were very interesting, to say the least. Sweat was interviewed several times. There was no doubt he wanted to tell his story and was very proud to state that he was the mastermind behind the escape and was taking all the credit. He described Matt in very unflattering terms, and he further made it absolutely clear that he was the smartest person in the room. As for Eugene Palmer, what was most striking to me is that he did not realize that these two murderers were manipulating him. He thought he was using and grooming these incarcerated individuals to provide him with information as to what was going on in the facility and to keep abreast of criminal and/or violent behavior, which never panned out to be credible information. Rather, it was Matt and Sweat who were grooming Palmer. Palmer would frequently escort Matt from the tailor shop to his cell, bypassing metal detectors, would warn him of possible cell searches, would conceal contraband that might be found in a search, and he had Sweat's cell relocated next to Matt's so they could be together. And most importantly, he had provided that frozen hamburger meat laden with tools and gave it to them in their cells. The MO of Matt and Sweat was that any person with whom they came into contact, be it staff, correction officers, or other incarcerated individuals, were all to be groomed and used. They were about manipulating everyone for their own personal needs and gain. Now, Joyce Mitchell consistently attempted to minimize the breadth and scope of her involvement with Matt and Sweat and her complicity in this escape. In her interview, she did not want to admit that she purchased the tools from local stores, that she put it in hamburger meat, froze the meat, and smuggled it into the correctional facility, that she bought a compass, that she provided maps, and that she provided many other items to these two incarcerated individuals. It was not until we showed her receipts that she would finally admit to purchasing these items. She also consistently minimized having any kind of romantic or intimate relationship with these two escapees, contrary to the evidence we received in interviews that we conducted with other witnesses. But she admitted to writing love notes to Matt and Sweat, but really didn't mean anything by it. Although she also admitted that she got caught up in the fantasy of running away to Mexico with Matt and Sweat. When speaking with Matt and Sweat about killing her husband, she explained, that those statements were just made in jest, and married people have arguments all the time. Mitchell's testimony was replete with offers of explanation which belied logic, in an attempt to minimize her culpability. Make no mistake, Mitchell, who admitted her guilt in criminal court and is a convicted felon, provided assistance to Matt and Sweat, which was critical to the success of this escape. Now, as for other interviews, a total of 175 were conducted of various individuals, some of them multiple times. Another difficulty encountered during this investigation was that many correctional officers who were questioned were either not forthcoming or truthful in their testimony. For example, some indicated they could not recall the names of people that they regularly worked with, or they couldn't remember their work activities the night of the escape and the morning thereafter. Such conduct and testimony was reprehensible, considering the magnitude of this escape and the security breaches implicated. Now, it should be noted that my report in the investigation is not an indictment against all correctional officers, as there were many who were indeed cooperative and were extremely embarrassed by what had happened. They felt this was a stain on their reputation and that of their profession. Now, on a daily basis during the investigation, I would hold early morning meetings before the teams were dispatched to undertake their tasks. Every evening, we would all regroup to share the day's information, and many days there were updates and meetings during the day or after receiving important information. The point was, information was shared in real time, which proved to be very effective, especially when we were conducting interviews. Now, as information regarding how the breakout occurred, and that was made to the public through sources other than my office, many people found it incredulous that power tools were not utilized and that Sweat used only crude and rudimentary tools. I recall one day walking into the office of one of my senior investigative attorneys who was with the chief auditor. And there on the desk was a steel pipe with a hacksaw sticking out of it. I looked at the pipe and I looked at them and I said, "What's going on?" And it was explained to me that they too had difficulty believing that you could cut into a steel pipe with a hacksaw. So they decided to see for themselves. And it was indeed true, and it could be accomplished. I left them to their business at hand. The escape made state, national, and international news. You could not walk anywhere in Clinton County without running into a reporter from somewhere. I recall one time learning and thereafter watching a news clip of a street reporter speaking with an anchor back in the studio. And while unbeknownst to those reporters, behind the street reporter, an individual walks up to the wall of the facility. A bucket is lowered. The person puts something in the bucket, and then the bucket is hoisted back up to what was the watchtower and guards in the watchtower. And then the individual walks away from the wall. And this was all in the tape recorded. I just watched in disbelief, and I just thought to myself, I don't have enough to investigate right now. And of course, this breach too is also investigated. And as you can well imagine, we had media requests for comments from all around the world. None were granted. As we undertook this investigation, no information was provided to ensure the integrity of the investigation. And in fact, the only interview I gave was after the issuance of my report in June of 2016, and it was to a North Country newspaper. I felt it was important for the residents of the North Country to hear directly from me what happened, the results of the investigations, and the corrective measures taken and to be taken, and to deliver that message to the people who were most affected. I met many people in the community, and while these convicted criminals were hiding in the Adirondack Mountains and all throughout the Adirondacks where they thought they were, people lived in fear. They did not feel safe and secure in their own homes, and they were scared for their family. They supported all of our law enforcement in so many ways that I felt I wanted to give back to the North Country community as a way of saying that we appreciate them, their support, and all that they had been through, and that they would hear directly from me what happened and how we were going to ensure that something like this was never going to happen again. An investigation of this importance and magnitude, as you can well imagine, utilized much of my office's resources. The men and women who worked on this investigation initially spent 4 months away from their homes, staying in and around the Clinton Correctional Facility. We had developed rotating teams so we can consistently conduct interviews, and that the investigation would not stop. It would be nonstop, without breaks, for months. These professionals from my office had a level of commitment that I had never seen before. They wanted to get to the truth, to find the facts. They turned over every stone, pursued every lead and piece of information. They never complained. Quite to the contrary, they were to the person all highly motivated. They held themselves to the highest standards we expect of public officers. Not only did they understand the enormity of this investigation and the task at hand, to accurately report to the public what had happened, what went wrong, but they too had intellectual curiosity as they wanted to know themselves. I would be remiss in telling this story if I did not recognize that the resources of our office were significantly decreased as it pertained to other IG investigations that were being conducted. I will note that professional staff who were not involved in the escape investigation stepped up and assisted with other ongoing investigations. Staff from around the state's offices not only assisted with the escape, but also pitch hit in assisting and completing investigations which were stalled due to this escape investigation. It should be noted that between the time of the escape of June 5th, 2015, until the day that this investigative report was released in June of 2016, excluding the escape report, 10 other comprehensive investigative reports were issued having to do with matters unrelated to the escape. This is truly a remarkable feat, and I am very proud of my entire IG staff at that time. I would also like to note that in 2015, immediately before the escape, I had assumed the offices of the Workers' Compensation Fraud Inspector General and subsumed all those fraud cases as well as the professional staff who investigated them. Suffice to say, this was an extremely busy and unprecedented time. This escape, which is obviously detailed and outlined in the 150-page report, underscores not only the actions of Sweat, Matt, Mitchell, and Palmer, but highlights the substantial breaches in security and management oversight. What was astonishing was the long-standing complacency exercised in lieu of security, and that those involved forgot that they were in charge of a maximum security correctional facility. The escape story, clearly one that movies are made of and have been made, should not concentrate on these defendants or criminals, but rather we should concentrate on the actions taken in the aftermath, the corrective measures taken, and the reforms instituted so that something like this could never happen again. During this momentous, anxious, and scary time in our state's history, the best of the best came together and performed extraordinarily. Let us remember all the law enforcement officers who successfully and admirably accomplished their task. Let us remember the North Country community who lived in fear, whose safety and security was jeopardized. And to the men and women of the Inspector General's Office of 2015 and 2016, who were the commensurate professionals and of whom I am so deeply proud of, whose investigative work resulted in a comprehensive report which has become a treatise in prison safety, security, and best practices. I am humbled and privileged to have served as the Inspector General during this time and have had the privilege and honor to have led an undeniably talented group of professionals during this investigation, an investigation of which I am proud of to this day. I thank you for the privilege of providing these introductory remarks, and I hope that you enjoy the panel presentation. Thank you.
Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to thank all of the agencies and people who participated in these tremendous efforts. Notably, the members of my own office whose hard work resulted in the report, which provides the framework for our conversation. I also want to thank Rockefeller Institute for welcoming us and the members of my team who made today's event happen. Audience members, there are note cards on your seats, so if you have questions for the panelists, please note them, and we will collect them before the question and answer begins. Now, today, together for the first time since the escape 10 years ago, I am so pleased to introduce three experts who lived through and led it. Commissioner Anthony Annucci served as acting commissioner of the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision from 2013 to 2023. In this role, he oversaw 50 correctional facilities where more than 30,000 people were incarcerated, 7 different regional bureaus where 31,000 parolees were supervised, a workforce of more than 25,000, and an annual budget of more than $3 billion. Until his retirement in 2023, Commissioner Annucci was employed with DOCS since 1989. Commissioner? Keisha Kluge. I'm going to send you that. Ms. Kluge is a Newsday correspondent who covers New York State government, politics, and policy. A native of Plattsburgh, Kluge spent June 2015 covering the Clinton Correctional Facility Escape for the Times-Union and was interviewed about the escape on national news outlets, including CNN, the BBC, NBC, and HLN. A year after the escape, she returned to the North Country to report for Politico magazine on the incident's lasting impact, including on our investigative report. Keisha? And Superintendent Joseph D'Amico. Superintendent D'Amico served as the 14th superintendent of the New York State Police from 2011 to 2016, during which he oversaw the state's 3-week manhunt involving more than 1,500 law enforcement officers and over 2,500 leads. Prior to that, Superintendent D'Amico served as chief investigator for the New York State Attorney General's office, and he spent 27 years with the New York City Police Department, where he served in many patrol and investigative assignments and ultimately rose to the rank of deputy chief. Superintendent. So let's by having you, Commissioner, set the scene for people who perhaps have not been to Clinton before. Where is it, and what are its unique characteristics? What kind of town? All of that sort of background information.
So back in 2015, DOCS had a total of 17 maximum security prisons, 16 of which were for males, 1 for females. That was Bedford Hills. Clinton was the largest at the time, and at the time of the escape, it had 2,653 incarcerated individuals. It consisted of both the main and what was called the annex. The annex has since been closed. And it was originally opened in 1847, and I think in 18 whatever, later that century, they manufactured the 30-foot high wall. So it is an institution that prided itself on being a facility where some of the worst incarcerated individuals were sent. History-wise, people like Lucky Luciano were sent to Clinton. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, 44 caliber killer, went to Clinton immediately when he came to state prison. People like Kenny Kimes, who was a serial killer. His mother was incarcerated at Bedford Hills, and during an interview with a reporter, he wrestled a pen, held it to her throat, and started issuing demands. We were able successfully to disarm him of that pen forcibly and with no loss of life, and the reporter was unharmed. And it is an institution that prided itself on being strong. I'll even share one anecdotal story with the audience. I have no idea if this was true, but the rumor was that in 1971, in the wake of the Attica riot, where 43 people were killed, the then warden, as he was called, of Clinton, had a group assembled in either the auditorium or gymnasium where they were going to see a movie. The lights were shut for a few seconds, then turned back on, and what the population saw, allegedly, were officers armed with rifles and shotguns, and the warden allegedly telling them that if you think any of you are going to do what happened at Attica here at Clinton, this is what you'll be met with. I have no idea if that's a true story, but stories like that add to the myth of Clinton being for the worst of the worst and not tolerating any nonsense. So, in fact, many individuals associated with Clinton had T-shirts that said Clinton Strong. So it was a facility that had a lot of pride and a lot of tradition, and really was stunned when this event happened. So it's located in the further reaches of the state, a little north of Plattsburgh, very close to the Canadian border. gained the nickname of Little Siberia because it was so cold in the North Country and many very difficult incarcerated individuals were sent there. Generally speaking, when you come into docks, the primary factor to determine whether you start out at a maximum or a medium or a minimum security facility is proximity to your earliest release date. Every inmate has a sentence calculated. Generally speaking, if you have 6 years or more to your earliest release date, you will start off in a maximum security prison. In addition, the department has a policy of area of preference closer to home. Many people come from the New York City, downstate area. The idea, if they behave well, they'll be able to transfer ultimately to facilities closer to New York City in the lower Hudson Valley area, et cetera. But once you get there, if you engage in gang activities or commit a serious disciplinary infraction, you can then be transferred back to a distant facility like Clinton or Attica or any of our other distant facilities. So they were used to dealing with a difficult population. I believe there hadn't been an escape there since 1912. So clearly there was a belief on their part, right, that this facility is secure. You see it as evidenced by the 30-foot high walls as soon as you enter the village of Dannemora. And that false sense of nothing can happen here played into the culture of complacency.
Is it true that the chapel on the facility grounds was donated by Lucky Luciano?
Well, Lucky Luciano donated the pews for the chapel, which is a beautiful chapel. It's named after Saint Dismas, who, according to the Christian religion, said, "Lord, remember me when you get to your kingdom," and he supposedly was promised paradise. But all of the work was done by the population, the stained glass windows and many other things. So contrary to what you see in the movies, a very dark, imposing structure with Clinton, is this beautiful chapel where individuals can have meaningful religious experiences there. And it was all done by the population. I believe there is even on the altar wood from Magellan's ship. So it's quite a historical story.
And critically, for purposes of this story, there's industry at Clinton. Yes. Which is the tailor shops.
The tailor shops. We have craft industries in many different institutions, and it was a big part of that prison's daily operations. They make uniforms for the staff, for other state and local jurisdictions, and other apparel. And basically, we want to keep everybody busy, right? We want to give them a reason to get out of bed in the morning. We have a lot of people that probably, given the length of their sentences, will never get out of prison. One time I know we had 200 serving life without parole. Many others with very long sentences. We have long sentences in New York State. So keeping the population meaningfully employed and taking pride in their work and making a contribution is something that's very important. Because at the end of the day, it is far more difficult for a prison system to prevent suicides than it is to prevent homicides by the population, which is a dramatic revelation given how many people have already committed homicide before they came to state prison. And I believe the numbers, when I was there over a 5-year period or a 4-year period, we averaged 1.2 homicides a year. Suicide's much more difficult, could be 16, could be 17, could be 18, and a big part of that, to prevent that, is give people a reason to believe. It's never too late to do good. It's never too late to take pride in your work. It's never too late to change the course of your life, even if it is in the setting of a correctional institution.
Now, Superintendent, all of that was probably not on your mind in the early morning hours of June 6, 2015. So where were you, and what did you and your colleagues in the state police do immediately when you got the call that there had been a security breach at Clinton?
So shortly after 6 a.m. on that morning, I received a call from State Police Commander, who told me that docs had notified them that they had 2 accounted for prisoners in Clinton. And I said, what does that mean, unaccounted for? And they said, well, they cut holes in their cells and they made it along a tunnel and ultimately popped a manhole a couple streets down. I said, well, that doesn't sound like unaccounted for. That sounds like escape. And they said yes. And immediately we put in the escape plan. And basically all New York State prisons have an escape plan. And it's devised together with law enforcement. And in the escape plan, there's images, there's maps, there's locations for additional resources to respond to. There's command post locations. There's everything you need to know to kind of stand up after an escape. And once a year, we would meet with corrections. We'd update it, we'd review it, and enhance it. And in this case, we put the plan in probably sometime around 6:30 in the morning, and by 7-something in the morning, all of the checkpoints in the plan, which took you out a number of miles from the prison, were all being staffed, some by corrections who were armed, and some by troopers. To follow that up, we probably had 200 more troopers on their way to the prison. And immediately we used canines and people to start doing searches from the manhole out. Without any information on how they did it or where they gone, we just started searching on the ground. At the same time, we started our investigation. We worked with corrections to kind of figure out who are these two inmates? Who are these two inmates tied with inside the prison system? And we came up quickly with Gene Palmer and Joyce Mitchell as two people they were very close with. Interesting enough, on that day, Palmer wasn't at work. He was on vacation, which made us suspicious. Maybe he knew it was going to happen, didn't come to work. And then Joyce Mitchell, who was supposed to work, called in sick, which again just raised our suspicions. We immediately set out to find both Palmer and Mitchell. That's early morning, I would say, of June 6th.
And Keisha, the news got out pretty quickly. So when and how did it come to the attention of the media and by extension, the public?
Yeah, so I think first thing in the morning or later, maybe around like 10 or 11, it was really started to be talked about on that Saturday. I personally was up in Plattsburgh. I have family up there. That's where I'm from. And was at Lowe's and had one of the retail clerks say, oh, did you hear two guys escape from Dannemora? And just to speak to the community thought on that is everyone went, oh, no, that can't be possible, or, oh, they probably caught them already, and just kind of went about my day, drove all the way back to Albany, got a call from my editor, are you still in Plattsburgh? Go back up. So I went right back up to Plattsburgh, started that Sunday, and there already were just so many members of the media. There were people from local outlets, there were people from national and international outlets, and I guess in the beginning, just trying to get any information possible. How did they escape? Who were they? How is this possible in this, really imposing facility? And then we started to get information from, I believe the governor did a press briefing. I believe you guys may have done the initial press briefing, and more information started to trickle out. But it was really initially going house to house, asking community members, what's happening? Where do you think they went? Did you hear anything last night? Those kind of questions.
And Commissioner, where were you when you first learned it had happened?
So I was at home, but I remember clearly that entire week. Earlier in the week, I had a college graduation at Clinton Correctional Facility. We have an arrangement with Bard College, and I supported higher education every opportunity I had. So I attend the event. I actually don the cap and gown, march in with the faculty, give a speech, and congratulate all the graduates. Then I had to travel to Lake Placid for a labor management meeting with PEF, which represents all of the professionals within our organization, such as nurses and counselors and parole officers, et cetera. And we have an open forum where they can ask me or any of my staff any question about anything. The representatives come from all parts of the state. They represent the entire PEF workforce, and then after the formality of the Q&As, then we have dinner together, and it's meant to encourage cooperation between management and labor, and it's well received by the union. Then later that week, I had to go back to Bedford Hills for a different college graduation with a different college partner. And I'm on the stage, and I made my speech already, had my remarks delivered, and the graduates are getting the diplomas, and then I get an urgent note you have to call your office. So I call my office and they say, you got to get back to Albany right now. The governor wants to go to a correctional facility next week, and he will let us determine which facility to see and work out the agenda, but you got to come back now, and we got to line that all up. By way of background, he had been already to Green Correctional Facility. That was part of his effort to highlight the changes he wanted to make and raise the age. And when he came to that prison, Governor, if you're listening, I hope but when he came to Green, he brings his own videographer, and he shows, you know, what he did. He met with some of the population, he toured an S block, etc. And this is also important. It's a story he's told several times. It helped shape his concern with prisons in general. In 1983, when his father was first elected governor, 11 days into his administration, and he was having dinner with his son Andrew, Mario, together in a restaurant in Manhattan. They got the call, major riot at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. And that riot was very serious. Whole cell block destroyed, and they had hostages. And it took 4 days of negotiation, including a breakdown in negotiation where they were ready to kill the hostages. Unfortunately, they got it back on the rails and were able to successfully resolve that without loss of life. And that was a big factor in his thinking, I think, about how prisons can be very dangerous places. So that Friday, I'm back. I meet with my team. We decide, for a lot of different logistical reasons, we will select Downstate Correctional Facility, which was also a maximum security facility. It's a reception center facility, so we can see how reception process works and how you process individuals into the system and do the time computation and all the things that they have to do, get clean shaven, et cetera, et cetera. And this would be educational for him. So that night, which was the Friday, June 5th, after all was said and done, and we had this all arranged, and you also have to coordinate this with the governor's security detail. You're not just going to meet the governor. You know, you have all the security people that are going to accompany him, and of course, no guns inside prison, so they had to understand that, surrender that at the arsenal. I did have to make exceptions to the long-standing rule of no cell phones in the prison. Obviously, the governor's team needs to have contact with the outside world directly while he's in there. But I remember thinking when I went to bed that night, okay, I really earned my salary this week, and I was going to get a good night's sleep.
Little did you know.
Little did I know, I'd call at whatever it was, 6:15 in the morning from, and I'll never forget it, lieutenant from the command center, sir, they're missing 2 at Clinton. What? We don't know if they've gone yet. They're searching the tunnels right now. They may still be in the tunnels. I'll call you back when we have definitive information. So I immediately called my deputy secretary for public safety that I reported to let them know that they're unaccounted for at this point. We don't know where they are or if they've gotten out or not. And then the second call came, and they hadn't even gotten out. And I reported that to him, and he did say, okay, it is possible that the governor may decide to come to the facility that day, because he is a governor that's very hands-on and wants to go directly to a significant event that's happening, whether it's a hurricane or a snowstorm or some other tragedy. He's not just in his office in Albany, he's coming to the scene. So, and that day, by the way, was a Saturday. It was the 3rd leg of the Triple Crown. And that was the horse American Pharaoh, who was running in the Belmont Stakes. That's the governor's original plan, to go there. American Pharaoh did win.
Arguably more fun.
Yeah, probably more fun. But he decided instead that he would come to Clinton. So I had already been there once. He came, and he immediately tried to follow the entire route of these individuals, went to their cells, inspected the back of the cells, went to the catwalk, and his videographer was filming all of this. And we basically retraced the steps of the 2 escapees. And it was just impossible for us to even, from corrections, digest that this possibly happened from point A to point B to point C to point D. D to point E and out the manhole covers. And what kind of tools did they use to get this? I mean, these cells, the back of their cells were steel, 3/16 of an inch steel. How do you get through that? How do you get through that undetected? How do you get through the brick walls? How do you get through the steam pipe? What was going on with all the counts and the procedures and the inspections that should have been taking place? So I think the governor, and I'll tell you a little humorous anecdotal story, seeing this stunned look on my face, decided to share that this reminded him of a cartoon that he saw in a magazine. And in the cartoon, what you see is a huge staircase and a human head on the staircase, not attached to a body, just the human head. It's rolling down the staircase, and the caption to the cartoon says, "Well, I guess things could be worse." So, I didn't feel better, but at least he had a little bit of perspective at that point in time.
Well, surely amongst the first things that you did were look into what the background was of the two men who had escaped. And if you can just very briefly describe what Matt and Sweat were incarcerated for.
Sure. Before heading directly to Clinton, I met my team in Albany. They prepared packets of information for me on these two individuals. David Sweat was serving a life without parole sentence for the crime of murder in the first degree, the callous murder of a deputy sheriff who encountered him and his accomplishments after they had burglarized a store and drove off and were divvying up the goods. He was shot multiple times and run over several times and then shot at point blank range. Now, New York State, when it reinstated the death penalty in 1995, allowed for the possibility for the imposition of a sentence, life without parole, for the intentional murder of the law enforcement officer. Clinton, by the way, was the facility we chose to house individuals who were under a sentence of death, and we had a number of them under sentence of death. I believe by the time Mr. Sweat was sentenced, the death penalty had already been declared unconstitutional in New York State, but it left open the possibility of a life without parole sentence, and that's the sentence that he received. Richard Matt was somebody who really committed a very, very callous offense. Basically, he was serving 25 to life. His boss, I think his name was Mr. Rickenshaw, had fired him 2 weeks earlier. And so he, with an accomplice, went to the house of that individual and demanded that he give over a lot of money that he thought was being kept in his house. The man didn't have the money. He was beaten mercilessly, then dumped in the trunk of the car that Matt and the accomplice had. They drove around, would periodically stop, open the trunk, beat him again, and finally, at the last stop, Matt broke this man's neck. And the next day, to dispose of the body, he came back to the scene with a hacksaw and sawed the man's body parts and then dumped them in a waterway someplace. So, and then before he could face justice on that, he escaped to Mexico, where he murdered a fellow American in a bar argument, knifing him to death. So he served about 8 years in the Mexican prison, and I believe in the IG report they also referenced newspaper articles where he tried to escape from that Mexican jail. He had previously escaped successfully from the Erie County Jail years earlier for a less serious offense, but he had an extensive history. He was a very serious, depraved individual who was capable of doing really heinous acts.
So, Superintendent, surely you had all this information and were sharing it with your troops on the ground. How did that inform how you were leading during that time and how your staff were approaching the manhunt?
So, I mean, once we had the information on the criminal background, especially Matt's, we knew they were desperate and they were capable of anything, serving long sentences. And, we feared right away that we were going to start to see crime victims that they would be, doing a burglary, doing a robbery, a carjacking, trying to get some means of escape. Around day 3, we had figured out that Joyce Mitchell was their getaway driver and that she left them on the scene. Some of the people who they encountered that night while they were standing outside the manhole kind of confirmed this. So we figured they set off on foot with no resources, and we were fully expecting to see crime victims as they tried to make their escape. As the days went by, we didn't see it, which gave us some confidence that they were still in the area. That's kind of the way we built it. And every day we would draw a circle 5 miles out. We thought they could do 5 miles in the terrain that was there. It was really wooded and heavy. There was marsh, there was mud, there was ponds. It would have been hard enough doing it in the daytime. To move that far at nighttime, we figured 5 was the maximum. Every day we came in, we drew a new circle 5 miles out, and we kind of moved our search area.
So while your team is conducting that investigation and others are in the facility, information's getting out about how the escape happened. Keisha, what supplies did it turn out they had used to craft their escape route?
So it's interesting because a lot of the things that trickled out early ended up being corroborated by the IG's report, which was very validating as a reporter, trying to, hear these things from law enforcement and people on the street, going to neighbors' houses, talking to just anyone you could find. So there were a number of tools. We heard about the saw blades in the meat, which I think was the biggest one, pretty wild, that these hacksaw blades, it ended up being a number of them because they would break as he was cutting. They ended up with a guitar case that they came out of, like a kind of a soft guitar case that they were planning on carrying around. Had food, backpacks. I believe David Sweat was kind of a survivalist, so he was reading books in the facility. And then they also could see, as the former IG mentioned, they could see the steam pipe at the bottom of the hill. So they kind of had a little bit of direction there. I think when they had more tools and supplies on the inside as a result of largely these two, Joyce Mitchell and Gene Palmer, who were actually Gene Palmer, interestingly, was trading a lot of things because Richard Matt was a wonderful artist. You can actually look at some of his paintings online, kind of interesting when you hear the description of this guy. And so he had actually made a painting for Gene Palmer of his fiance for their anniversary gift, and that later was burnt in Gene Palmer's backyard. He had tried to get rid of this evidence later on. And so a lot of those things were shared. But when it comes to being in the Adirondacks, they really didn't prepare for being out in the woods. They were sort of prepared for a car journey, which Joyce Mitchell was supposed to pick them up at the manhole. And when she did not, they kind of, walked around, tried to get their bearings, and then headed off towards the woods. And I just wanted to add kind of just the idea of the area. There's sort of a hill that goes down. It's all houses. It's just this residential community. And if you take a right, it goes to this old ATV trail. It used to be a railroad. And so that goes right up into the woods, goes into cabins and things like that. If they had come back up towards the prison and taken the road, they were only a few miles from Canada. They would have gotten there in one night if they had known where they actually were. So I think that they didn't have an idea of the immediate local vicinity.
Yeah. And Superintendent, in addition to being on the outside working in those concentric circles, you had your team, and there was the IG team on the inside. Can you talk through what you learned about the route that they ultimately took to get beyond the prison's walls, and then we'll show the video? Sure.
So, Sweat did most of the work. He would, every night after bed check at 11:30, he would go through the hole in his cell. He'd remove a cardboard piece that he had fashioned and painted using paint from the artwork, and he would drop down 3 floors from the catwalk, and he would make his way along the tunnels. And it took him a couple of months. He worked at it. First he explored to kind of get his bearings, and then at some point the pipes run from one building to another, and there's a big brick enclosure with a hole in the middle. Some of those he was able to get through. Others, he had to remove bricks, and he had some tools. There was metal he found down in the tunnel. There was hacksaw blades. There was, I think he had a chisel at some point, even had a hammer at some point that he found in a work box that was left unattended down in the, under the catwalks. And he worked at it, and he made sure that not only could he get through the hole, but also that Matt, who was somewhat, overweight, would also be able to make it through the hole. And he finally, he gets to that wall on the outer edge, and his first thought was to go through it, and then he realized it's tremendous amount of feet, thought about going under it, which would have been a bad idea also. And at that point, there's the steam pipe that goes down to the steam plant, and this is now June. Sometime in May, the steam was shut off for the heat in the winter, and they could see the plume coming out of the plant a few blocks away, and the pipe was cool. And he could see that there was no water in it, and he began to cut in with the hacksaw blade. And once he was inside, he worked his way, what he thought was past the wall, and cut through the pipe from inside using the hacksaw blade, and ultimately kicked it out. It was hot in the tunnel, and he fashioned a couple of fans that he bought up in the commissary, and he lay in there every night and did it. Once he kicked his way out the other side, he was on the other side of the wall, just on the other side. His timing was perfect. He made his way down, and he popped his head up to the first manhole he found, which was unsecured. And it was somewhat in view of the wall of the prison, and he panicked. He says, it's too close, they're gonna be able to see me. So he came back a little bit to a second manhole that was chain closed, cut it open with the hacksaw blade. And on the early morning of the 5th, somewhere, 4:30, 5 o'clock, he pops open the manhole, and he sees freedom. But he doesn't go, because for 3 reasons, basically. One, it was only an hour or two before bed check, where they would come down, so he didn't really have a head start. Second, his ride wasn't, in place yet. They were going to get Joyce Mitchell to pick them up. And the third part was he felt some loyalty to Matt. He had made the plan with Matt, and he was going to take Matt out with him. So, I can't imagine what was going through his head as he popped open the manhole, brought it back down, went back, climbed all the way up through his cell, washed up, and went to sleep. I mean, he was this close to freedom, and he had to wait another day to get out through the cell. Ultimately, that night, the two of them slipped out, and when they came out, they were carrying a backpack and a soft guitar case, which they loaded with supplies. And when they came up at about 11:30, they waited, no Joyce Mitchell. Joyce Mitchell was supposed to bring 2 pills home that they had given to give to her husband to knock him out so she can get out of the house. And whether their intent was to come back and kill him is questionable, because they actually liked the husband. The inmates liked Lyle, who also worked in a prison. And after a little while, they realized she wasn't coming. And they kind of hid there, and somebody came home and saw them, and they made some excuses about cutting through the yard. But at that point, they realized we better go, and they set off on foot.
And Keisha, what had actually happened to Joyce Mitchell at that time when they came out of the manhole and it turned out she wasn't there?
So I think she started to really second guess what she was doing, which is interesting after all of these months. And kind of had, my understanding is, had a panic attack, went to the hospital thinking it was like a heart attack, and really it was this panic attack from this. And eventually, whether she was questioned first or had told first that this was going to happen, and then I imagine she saw on the news too that they had escaped. I think there was some question too of, it's one thing to say that you're going to escape with these people, but then when you actually think about the things that they've done and why they're in there, I think that probably gave her some pause as well.
Superintendent, what was happening with the investigation in the woods, and what did you learn that they were doing to keep themselves alive while the manhunt continued?
So one of the things that we did know is that Sweat was a survivalist. He read all the books in the library, kind of preparing for this. It turns out the night they left and they set off on foot, they probably traveled on the road and ducked in when they saw headlights and stuff. It's really a remote area. I'm not even sure how many cars would have passed by on the overnight. But they really did a decent distance on the ground. This is, again, unbeknownst to us. So, in the first week, we were doing the evidence. We were doing interviews of everybody on the inside, of anybody remotely related to either of them. We were doing surveillance on their phones. We were up on telephones in case they tried to reach out to them. We were interviewing and surveilling Mitchell, Joyce Mitchell. We were surveilling Palmer's house. We had bait cars in the woods with GPS. We had sensors on the trail beds and cameras on the rail lines. We were hoping somewhere we would pick up some indication of them. And, you know, that went a good week like that, and with no results. You know, we used bloodhounds a little bit in the beginning, but they ended up on a track that they lost. And because of the rain and stuff like that, it really eliminated any future use of the dogs for tracking.
There were also some hunters too that had like their own trail cams. I remember looking at a lot of their websites and thinking, is this so-and-so? And one were just two guys checking, you know, hunting in the woods. And I think that was one of the many tips I'm sure came in.
And that set off law enforcement. There was two people on a trail cam. One of them had a shotgun. And we actually ended up locating the two hunters and put that one to rest. Because of the media attention, I mean, as you've heard, it was national, it was international, and there was a $100,000 reward put out by the, you know, the governor's office. The tips were coming in hot and heavy, and you know, we followed up on everyone. Some were 30 miles away, some were 300 miles away, and we took the time to kind of run down each one because the truth is we didn't know for sure where they were.
Yeah. Speaking of the media, Keisha, my colleagues who were on the ground remember that it was so hot up there that all the media were wearing their sport coats for TV with shorts underneath. What was the vibe like in the community and with the media amidst all this tension?
I actually wanted to point out, I think that that person in the pink sitting on the ground is me actually. And I had I took one day off during the search, and it was the day that Matt got caught or killed. And I was running from the beach with my mom, threw on my sweater. So it was very much like, you know, you're up there the whole time, you're in your car for, I mean, I basically lived out of my car. You had to have food with you because you didn't know where you were driving. At a moment's notice, at all times I had 3 or 4 sources that would kind of ping for me, hey, I'm seeing search over here, I'm seeing search over there, and then if any two could corroborate it, you'd drive to that area and kind of try to figure out what's going on. And there definitely was this like media excitement. You want to get the scoop, you want to get the story, there's a lot of attention on it. You're competing, you know, your smaller local outlets competing with the New York Times, competing with all these other outlets. So there was definitely this feeling of just like, you got to get it, you got to be the one to scoop it. It was very hot. There were some residents that gave us sunscreen. Thank you. We had, you know, thinking you're going to be up there a day or two, I had to go to Target and buy some clothes because all of a sudden I'm on national television and I only brought, you know, 1 or 2 actual outfits to wear, and the rest were just shorts and like throw on a blazer kind of thing. There were news outlets washing their clothes in their hotel room sinks. So it was very hard. It was also very rainy. I think one of the photos you showed had a lot of these. We really felt for the people that were out there searching in the woods, because they, you know, are wearing their docs certified, you know, SWAT outfits, but they're putting their boots together with duct tape. I mean, it was wet. It was wet almost the entire time. It was hot, so it was not very comfortable. And then there was just this sense of like that excitement, that sort of like, wow, this is happening here, but also a fear, because there's these guys that are on the loose, and there were a lot of, in the community, there was that pride, that Clinton strong. So there was a lot of shame around the fact that these guys got out, around the fact that there were all these issues at the prison. Not all of the officers were involved in those, but definitely looked poorly on the prison. And there was a lot of goodwill in the community too. I actually had a former schoolmate whose husband was in the state police, and she was talking about how it was like sending her husband off to war every day, because you just didn't know they're going to be out in the woods. You didn't know if they were armed. They're going through all this, so people would supply, you know, extra socks, food. I think for Father's Day there were like free haircuts for all the law enforcement that were doing this. So there really was a sense of like the Clinton Strong motto really went to the community. unity as well, and really trying to band together, but also that fear. And I think especially at night, that fear would hit you. I had some incidents myself where I'm driving like, oh, I'm gonna get the scoop. I'm driving around Owl's Head at night, make a turn. There was all the floodlights, the guys with the guns around the perimeter. You're like, oops, maybe I shouldn't have driven down this road, get to the end of it, and then they're not there anymore, and it's just you. And you're like, ooh, I really want to be back where they are, because, you know, they could just pop out of the woods anywhere. So there really was this like strong fear as well, because you just don't know what they were going to do. And as they were getting closer, sort of that cornered feeling.
Yeah. So Superintendent and Commissioner both, this was such a fascinating study in leadership. How did you first keep up morale amongst your staff on day 14, day 20 of the manhunt? And then second, how did you keep the rest of the trains running? Because you also had state police who just had to do their ordinary job, and you had however many dozens of additional facilities that had to keep operating. So what were the leadership lessons, and how did you get it all done?
So I would say, you know, in the first week, people were highly motivated. Everyone was excited to be a part of it, and, you know, waiting for that break. Going into week 2, you know, it got a little more difficult. Every day I would watch the troops go out and come in, and as you say, muddy and wet, and they were really determined, and they kind of kept at it. A couple times we asked ourselves, are we in the right place? And we said, we are. This is the right place for us to be searching. We were confident about our plan. I'm sure there were people who second-guessed and said, why are you here? Why are you searching here? But, you know, we felt good about it, and we tried to tell them every day. As far as staffing, we had everyone on the search was doing 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Probably had 1,200 people at the peak searching on any given day. That's from all of the law enforcement pieces, including our federal partners and all of the support. And to supplement back in the troop, we brought in people from all around the state. You know, so there was the logistical issue of feeding them and finding them room and board, and the everyday thing of batteries, insect spray, and you name it, you know, sunblock, all of that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of planning that went into it. When we hit day 14, the investigation just got a natural shot in the arm. That was the incident at Owlhead. So an individual who was employed by Corrections, who had this hunting camp deep in the woods, said, let me go check on my camp. He took an ATV and his dog, and he rode deep into the woods. As he approached his camp, the dog started barking, and he saw somebody run out the back of the house. So we take a look, and we find a Department of Corrections stuff left behind, like underwear and toothbrush and toothpaste. And that wasn't, you know, really a sure thing that this was our people, because everyone in the area was Corrections. So, you know, could somebody have brought home the toothpaste or the underwear, you know? But we scooped everything up, and we helicoptered it down to Albany, and our forensic lab worked on it. And within 24 hours, we had a DNA hit that both Matt and Sweat were in the house. So that really was a shot of adrenaline to everybody. Everybody got super fired up. We refocused our investigation in Owl's Head at that point, and we started working out into, you know, into rings. That was just natural energy.
And had they taken things from the cabin?
So what we learned is that they were there for a while. They were probably there from right after they escaped. They probably made their way there first, and they found this cabin and maybe others, and they got comfortable. They found food, they found clothing, they found boots, they found alcohol. Somewhere along the way, we believed they found marijuana. They were getting high every day. They got lazy. They got real lazy. They were out there, and you know, truthfully, they should have kept moving to try to stay ahead, but they didn't. And so it helped us. We felt we were in the right place, and that was just an affirmation for us.
Yeah, and how'd you keep the rest of the state police who weren't focused on the manhunt? How'd you keep them busy and keep doing that part of the job?
Well, I think, you know, people were paying attention. We were rotating people in, trying to give people some days off here and there. So everybody kind of, from all over the state, had some time that they were on the line there. So everybody had some kind of vested interest in it.
And you, Commissioner?
Yeah. First of all, I know the superintendent will agree with this. Major Guest was the right man at the right time. He did an outstanding job, a real leader. And I would attend the briefings every day. Sometimes he'd ask me to give the final word. I wasn't really giving anything of practical investigatory advice to anybody, but I was mostly thanking everybody. And sometimes when people would disagree on whether we should search here or there, and there was a little bit of frayed tempers, I would stand up and say, listen, these guys got every possible break so far. It's like if you flip a coin 9 times and they needed it to be heads 9 times in a row, it came up heads 9 times in a row. They got every break. But it could be that 10th time or the 11th time, it's going to come up tails. Even though it's a 50-50 proposition, it's eventually going to come up tails. I said they're going to make a mistake. So we need to continue to do what we're doing. And I think it was Chuck who coined the phrase, today's the day, right? He'd walk in and he'd greet his staff, today's the day, remind them, today's the day that we may have that break, we may have that final lead. And as you described it, it came at that location because that was the first real solid proof we had that they were still in the area. We didn't know. I mean, it's possible they could have gotten out on a railroad car or somebody else picked them up that they may have had a secondary connection to. Who knows? I mean, I would watch the nightly news programs and we don't know where they are. They could be anywhere in the world. And it was very embarrassing, and I know there was a lot of pressure on everybody, but the sheer determination of everybody in that search, they were not going to let them win. I'll tell you one quick anecdotal story. There was a point, I'm not sure exactly what day it was, but we thought they might have been in this fairly large but enclosed area. So what we did was we stationed troops and my CERT team members every, I don't know, 50 yards, 70 yards, whatever it was, so that line of sight was continuous. And I said, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to go around with my CERT commander, Dennis Bradford, and the lieutenant from Clinton, Menard, and my deputy commissioner, Joe Bellner, 2 vehicles. I want to go to each person who's stationed there. I want to get out of the car, I want to shake their hand, and I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart for what they're doing and how appreciative we are. And by the way, every time we stopped, we needed, oh no, we've got all kinds of cold drinks, we've got food. The people in the town were so incredibly generous and appreciative of their presence. And when we stopped at one location where there was an officer who was manning his post by himself, but he clearly was exhausted and he was a bit wobbly. And we felt that we needed to relieve him. It took 20 minutes of convincing by this lieutenant, who was kind of a fatherly type, with this officer, that for the good of everybody, please, we need to relieve you. We need to have somebody. He did not want to relinquish his post. That kind of determination permeated throughout every unit, every person, state police, docs, customs officials, sheriffs, whoever was participating in this. They just absolutely were not going to let these guys win. And they didn't win at the end of the day.
Which brings us to Superintendent and in Malone, New York on June 26th. What happened?
So the 2 of them had made it to a house, another camp in Malone, New York, and were, again, holed up over there. They found alcohol, they were drinking, and they were feeling kind of comfortable, I guess. When they left the Owl's Head camp, they also took a 20-gauge shotgun and some shells. So we believe they had a disagreement at the Malone location, and Sweat wanted to get away. He wanted to get to Canada. That was his plan. And Matt wanted to shoot it out with the police. He thought that was the way to get away. And I believe at that point, Sweat said, "You're on your own. I'm out of here. I'm going to Canada." So Matt, who was apparently drinking, went outside and lay down along a roadway behind some rock wall, a little rock wall, and he watched cars passing by. And he waited until this an SUV driving by, pulling a trailer. And he took a shot at it, and he ends up hitting the side of the trailer. And the person driving heard it, thought they had a blowout, but nothing happened, so they continue on. Somewhere down the road, 5, 6, 7 miles, they pull over to check it out, and they see they have this, the hole in the side. and they dialed 911. So there were plenty of people searching close by, but not right there. We dropped 2 tactical teams in and started searching. One of the teams was a New York State Police team, and the other one was a CBP team of specialists called BORTAC, Border Patrol. The 2 teams started searching this area, and at one point, a trooper on the tactical team heard Matt cough, radioed to the CBP officers, who then came upon him. He pointed the shotgun at him, and a couple of shots were fired by Border Patrol, which killed Richard Matt. So again, at that point, we recentered our search, now using that Malone location, but we started asking, where's Sweat? And we had this really horrible feeling that maybe things went wrong and Matt killed Sweat. Because we always thought that Matt was a little bit more vicious. Even though Sweat killed a deputy, Matt's crimes were just more vicious. And he had the nickname of Hacksaw from dismembering his boss, which he was convicted of. So we started thinking, oh my God, if he kills Sweat and dumped him in these woods, we'll never find him. Between the animals and the terrain and everything else, we'll be searching here for the rest of our lives. So we said, okay, let's put that thought out of our head and kind of move forward. So we started searching from that location, and then 2 days later, in the town of Constable, again, the search teams, one of the mobile search teams being led by a sergeant, sees an individual cross a road into a field with a backpack on. And he pulls up and he gets out of the marked state police car, and he indicates for him to come over, and the individual tells him no. And he tells him no, come over here so I can speak to you. And again, he tells him no. And he turns and starts running for a wood line. He drops his backpack, and he's making a break for it. The sergeant runs after him into the field, and realizing he's not going to catch him, fires 2 shots at him from a distance of maybe 70 yards, a shot that is really unheard of, and hits him twice. And it turns out it's David Sweat, and he's taken into custody at that time.
Well, of course, the Inspector General's investigation continued well beyond the conclusion of the search for Matt and Sweat. And you heard from my predecessor that during that investigation, the office conducted sworn interviews of more than 175 people, conducted on-site examinations of the cells and escape route, as well as housing blocks, catwalks, tailor shops, and other areas in Clinton. Among tens of thousands of pages of documents reviewed were docs directives, Clinton procedures, staffing charts, incarcerated individual account slips, cell block and tailor shop logs, cell search records, unusual incident reports, disciplinary files, docs audit reports, records of docs Office of Special Investigations, and the report uncovered huge gaps in internal controls. And now I'm going to put a few additional questions, but I would invite you all to take this opportunity to write your questions and pass them towards the aisle, and members of the OIG staff will collect any questions you have. Keisha, while we do that, what were some of the major failures identified by the report about what led to the escape?
Yes, this really, I think you said with the quarter, I mean, they really got break after break after break. It was a series of unfortunate events. They were not checking staff bags correctly. They were not putting things through, through the system so that you could see if there was metal detector or something like that. At night, they were doing the shift. For the night shift, they would check at the beginning of their shift, and they would check at the end of their shift, and that was it. And then they would, there was even talk of some officers potentially having day jobs and taking a little nap at night during their shift. So they should have been checking the cells more regularly at night. They weren't. I also believe that they had made dummies and put them in their cells. So if you were looking, you would see someone was there, but really they should be doing these checks to go in. They also weren't checking, doing the full cell searches on a regular basis, so that they would actually take everything out and have seen the hole with the cardboard in the back of the cell. They also were on the honor block, which meant that they had specific privileges that others didn't for good behavior, presumably. And so they were able to have things like they had the paint set and they had things like that. And I think with their relationship with Gene Palmer, who was trying to cultivate them as sources to, get insights into what other prisoners were doing, they were given additional things. They had a hot plate. They had like electricity. At one point, they were allowed behind the catwalk so that they could work the electricity for their hot plate. So these were just a number of things. And then I thought it was funny because historically, as we were looking through this, as days were passing on the search, we're looking for what's our story today, what's our story today. There was actually, and there is a prison museum down the road in Dannemora, which you can still go to, has a number of things. And they talked about how in 1929 there was actually a prison riot, which is why the powerhouse was located outside of the prison and why that steam pipe went underneath the walls. So they even lucked out by having the steam pipe, which I believe in the 90s, it used to be filled with water full time for security purposes, but due to some budget cuts and things like that had stopped being powered up fully round. So they even had, like, from 1929, this one thing in line with them. So they really took advantage of all these things. Also, one of the biggest things was they were supposed to be doing rounds underneath in the tunnels, and they were not doing that. I heard some stories about it's not a very pleasant area, so people didn't want to go down there and do it, so they just weren't doing it. So I think all of these things were taking place.
And of course, the unauthorized relationship between Joyce Mitchell and one of the incarcerated individuals had been investigated, although not thoroughly and ultimately cleared. And a galling fact that's pointed out in the report is that one of the officers who did the nightly rounds and was duped by the dummy of Sweat had in fact been duped by a dummy previously on the job, and that was found out during the course of the investigation. So all of these lapses were symptomatic of what many witnesses told our office constituted a long-time culture of complacency at Clinton. Commissioner, what changes did the department make immediately to prevent this from happening in the future?
Well, we made a number of changes immediately, directly related to the ultimate findings of the Inspector General's office, who we were working with along the way to make sure that your office was comfortable with the changes and recommended these changes, even though the report hadn't been issued. So everything from ensuring that supervisors are present at the entrance to the facility, that bags are being checked, that proper way to conduct cell inspections. We immediately launched on getting all kinds of new technological equipment to assist staff in performing their jobs, such as a rounds tracker system to make sure that if you have that midnight shift, that you are actually getting up, circulating around the cell block and doing the count, because if you're not, then the rounds tracker won't be checked that you were actually up and making that round. Thermal imaging devices to verify that there is a live breathing body in the cell, which, by the way, it's not just to ensure that they haven't escaped. Somebody could have a medical emergency in the middle of the night, and if they are somebody in diabetic shock and need immediate medical assistance, the officer is the one that's there to potentially save that person's life. Not to mention potential suicides. Incarcerated individuals will wait to when they believe they're alone if they're determined to take their lives, when security staff won't make a round. And obviously, if they know, as happened at Clinton, that they do the final count at 11:30 and won't see an officer again until 5:30, it gives them a huge window to potentially take their own life. The other thing I did, and there's so many not minor, but detailed things that we instituted immediately. I got every single superintendent on the phone, and I had brutally frank conversations with each one of them. And I said, I want you to imagine right now that within your staff, you have the functional equivalent of Joyce Mitchell and the functional equivalent of Gene Palmer. Are you confident that the policies you have in place that they would be stopped from allowing an individual to escape from your facility? And if your answer is, well, if I have one, I'm confident, but both of them, I'm not sure, that's not acceptable. So I made it very clear going forward what was expected of everyone. And by the way, the IG report is mandatory reading for the entire superintendent ranks. Every time we made a new superintendent, you have to read this report. It's also shared with correctional systems around the country. And we had our own presentation. I know Joe did his presentation, but elsewhere in the country, they wanted to hear in intimate detail exactly what had happened. And relationships, unfortunately, as happened at Clinton, are not isolated instances. They do happen. They were key to escapes in other jurisdictions. They didn't generate the circus media that we experienced, in large part, which was generated by the films we had made of the actual escape, showing the video of the cutout cells, the dummies, the insulting notes they left behind, the manhook, everything. That really spurred media interest. And so it made our jobs more difficult because we had this absolute tsunami of media coverage while we're trying to do our respective jobs and make the corrections that were needed. But elsewhere in the country, they all wanted to learn from this. They all wanted to hear presentations on how it happened. And it continues to this day to be a challenge for every correctional administrator in the country. When you have human beings that are sharing the same physical space over time, incarcerated individual might be doing 25 to life. Staff are doing it in 8-hour shifts, spending the same side-by-side time with that individual as doing 25 to life. It's a challenge to keep that boundary, to not allow yourself to be friendly to the ones that are polite to you, to accidentally mention personal details about your own life with other staff that they may overhear. I heard one incarcerated individual who was released. He did many, many years for serious crimes. He said, look, if I was instructing people who were coming into your prison to become volunteers, I would tell them, the first time you're approached by somebody you're working with, and they say, oh, geez, I don't have good eyeglasses here, I can't get a decent pair. Do you think you might be able to get a $5 pair from Walmart's or whatever? And the person agrees to that, they've got you. That's how clever a lot of these individuals are. And so your security is only as good as your weakest link. And if it's a single person and if they're involved in a relationship, it could undo and create the tsunami of the manhunt that we all had to experience back in 2015.
Well, I'm going to do a rapid fire on a couple questions from the audience. Superintendent, how real was Ben Stiller's miniseries, Escape at Dannemora?
Well, I actually enjoyed it. I thought Ben Stiller got very close to real. I think he took a little bit of a poetic exaggeration on some of the items, but for the most part, there was a scene in there where they're in Malone and they're drinking grape gin. In the Malone house, there was a bottle of grape gin. So he really did his homework on it. The only part that I really questioned was there was a piece where they're on the side of the road and they hear a trooper up on the road and they're thinking about shooting him. And I don't know that ever happened, but he did a phenomenal job of capturing what really occurred. Worth watching.
Keisha, what type of approach would you take to produce a report on the Clinton break while respecting the integrity of the ongoing OIG investigation? How did you maintain that?
It was definitely a difficult balance. I was given some information that we have our own media ethics code, and so sometimes I would get photos, like I had a photo immediately of Richard Matt shot dead that someone sent to me, and my editor was like, we're not running that. I mean, you just have to be respectful of certain things. So there is an ethics code to journalism. Also, there were times where we were going with the crowd and maybe you went a little too far. For example, we weren't getting any information, so we went out on an ATV. Some guy said, "Pop on my ATV, we'll go to my house." We were there, and we saw the officers coming out of the woods, rifles raised, and we were like, press, press, press. Oh shoot, this was a bad idea. Never did that again. Stayed behind the lines and just, made sure that we were having that respect. So I think you can go too far with the crowd. And when you do that, you have to take a step back and look at yourself and say, am I helping this investigation or am I hindering it as a member of the media? And I think we had a lot of those ethical conversations going on while this was happening.
Superintendent, do you believe that they would have been successful going through the wall if the steam pipe had not been shut off, or would that have thwarted the escape?
No, they never would have made it through the wall. The wall was 30 feet high, 15 feet deep, and I think wide, somewhere around 7 feet. They were not getting through the wall. So, I mean, their only choice at that point was to go through that pipe.
And someone wants to know if you think that Mitchell's hesitancy was due to subconsciously realizing she wouldn't be safe from them on the outside or have the same amount of control.
Yeah, I mean, what we truly believe is that the night that they were escaping and they were having dinner, Mitchell and her husband, she started to have heart palpitations. I think she realized that when they got free, they were going to kill her. The plan, the way they discussed it, was to be picked up on that corner. They were going to drive into West Virginia in one shot and then make their way to Mexico, where Matt allegedly had contacts. And I think the more she thought about it, they're like, why do they need me? So I think that's what stopped her.
And Commissioner, in 30 seconds or less, a very easy two-part question. What are systemic and structural solutions to abuse in law enforcement? Or do you think that there is an inherent tension between investigations, watchdog agencies, and law enforcement?
Well, I don't think there's an inherent tension. I think the days of turf wars are long gone. I mean, we just all are on the same page. We all recognize that we're all about eliminating fraud, abuse in our system. And it takes a lot of resources to do that. Your office has a lot more resources. We have a lot of resources. So certainly, I think that can be done, and it's important that it be done. And we all work together to make sure we have the same outcome.
So ultimately, Joyce Mitchell, defended by a Clinton County public defender, pleaded guilty to promoting prison contraband and criminal facilitation. She was sentenced to 2 1/3 to 7 years in prison, fined $6,375, and ordered to pay $79,841 in restitution. Mitchell was granted parole and released from prison in February of 2020. Gene Palmer pleaded guilty to promoting prison contraband and was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,375. He served 4 months and was released for good behavior. Richard Sweat pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of first-degree escape and an additional count of promoting prison contraband. He was sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years to be served consecutively with his previous life sentence, and he remains in DOC's custody. All panelists sitting here, basically a decade later exactly, what do you view as the most important lesson from this chapter in New York State history? If we could start with you, Commissioner.
Sure. So I think in the IG report, to boil it down to its essence, they interviewed a lot of incarcerated individuals. When one person, they quoted him, stated words to the effect of, DOC's security policies are fine. That's not the problem. The problem was staff not carrying out the policies that they were supposed to carry out. So in a nutshell, it's not just important to have very detailed policies, and our directives span 7 volumes of everything that all staff are supposed to do in our system. Very large, very complicated system. But you must have a very rigorous system of checks to make sure that staff are doing what they're supposed to. And the other thing related to that, harping on relationships, people share the same space over time. I think it's kind of like a variation of the theme of Stockholm Syndrome that happens, that people who shouldn't be forming bonds are forming bonds in correctional facilities. So just like outside law enforcement that continually broadcasts messages to the general public. If you see something, say something. We send similar messages throughout the system. It's not just up to the supervisors. It's up to every employee. If you see something, report it so that we can intervene and take action, even an anonymous report. And before I left, they were sending out reports to the superintendent listing at this facility, this is the employee that was just caught and they were terminated. This relationship happened here, and I helped edit the introduction to say, like a cancer, these people have to be removed from the workforce. So that is my essence, lesson learned.
And as you know, our office now conducts training for every incoming class of corrections officers on the public officers law, including the duty to report. Keisha, lessons.
I think just like the ID report said, the complacency was the issue. You know, even as a kid, I remember asking people, you know, aren't you afraid living near Dannemora prison? It's so scary. There's like, you know, all these people inside. And they would say, no, nothing's ever happened here. If someone escaped, it's all correction officers that live in that community. They catch them really early. And I think that was the big thing is like, oh, if I don't go through the security check, doesn't matter because it's so secure. You know, all these little things added up. And I think just that feeling that it can't happen here, well, it can and it did, and it costs millions of dollars to the state, you know, potentially costs lives. So I think that was a big lesson learned.
So for me, I think I'm luckiest because my day didn't start until the holes were cut. So I didn't have to deal with all of the correction issues. But there's two things that I think about when I think back on the time in the escape and the manhunt. The first one is that every day we brought in 1,000 to 1,200 people there from multiple agencies, state, local, federal, and people check their ego and their attitude at the door, and in most cases their opinions, not in all cases. And we formed one cohesive team. We met, we briefed every day, we agreed on what we were doing. And it wasn't just the people you see. It wasn't the uniformed people who were standing along the road. It was investigators following leads, people processing evidence. It was pilots. It was press officers. It was FBI agents and analysts, you know, processing leads. It was our forensic people in Albany. Everybody was so bought into this. Everybody had a vested interest, and you know, in the end, for law enforcement, a tremendous success. Right? I couldn't find a better way for it to end than apprehension of 2 people, no other victims, no law enforcement was injured, no other New Yorkers were injured, and you know, they kind of brought their fate upon themselves. That's the first piece. The second piece I would call support. On the morning of the 6th, I kissed my wife Judy goodbye and didn't see her for 3 weeks. She ran my life and my house and everything else. That story could be repeated 1,000 times. Everybody who walked out the door that day didn't come back because they had to work. And somebody said deployed like in the military. That's what it was like. You know, you packed up, you went, and you didn't come home. You kind of lived there. So without that support, it's hard to be effective. The second part of this is New Yorkers. And that's a theme you've heard throughout this whole thing. You know, every day we drop down 1,000 people in your community, we trample your property, we search your sheds and your garages, and stop your car every time you turn the corner. It was tough for the people in the North Country. And how did they respond to us? Not anger, with generosity and compassion. You know, they would see law enforcement out there, they would feed them. They would give them beverages. You heard this, you know, haircuts on Father's Day. And one thing that was really poignant to me, there was a day that it was raining. It was really gray and nasty, and we had a lot of uniforms lined up on this little rural road forming a human barrier. And I saw a resident come out and set up a tarp, you know, a tent, so that a trooper could stand under the tent and not be wet. I mean, I was so impressed by that. All I could say is the support that we got from the community, from the people of the North Country, I will be forever grateful. You have my respect. So.
Well, many, many thanks to the panelists, the audience, the law enforcement and other agencies who conducted these investigations, the OIG team who handled our investigation and report, and the OIG team who worked to make today a success. Finally, thanks to the great people of the state of New York for all the reasons that my colleagues up here have mentioned for rallying around these efforts, and thanks for tuning in today. To read the 150-page Inspector General report in its entirety, if you didn't get enough today, you can scan the QR code on the screen or find it at ig.ny.gov. And this is a reminder to anyone who suspects fraud or corruption in New York State government to please report it to 1-800-DO-RIGHT and follow our work on @New York State IG. Excelsior.